Sony's initial attempt to break into the handheld market had been commendable. While the PSP was ultimately crushed by Nintendo and the DS, it still sold over 80 million units and pushed the boundaries of what could be achieved with a handheld console. Rumours of a PSP follow-up initially started to circulate in 2009, after a Eurogamer article reported that Sony was working on their new handheld, implying that it would have similar power to that of the original Xbox. Sony denied all speculation on the new handheld, even its existence, right up until it was revealed in January of 2011 at Sony's PlayStation meeting event in Japan. Referred to as the next generation portable, Sony claimed that they were aiming to have visuals that were comparable to the PS3, though this was later backtracked on, a Sony engineer clarifying that it would be somewhere between the PSP and the PS3. It's difficult to gauge exactly where it fell on the spectrum of power, especially due to its form factor, but regardless of this, it's going to be impressive to see this level of power in a handheld. Later that year at GDC, Sony revealed more details about the upcoming console. It would feature a 5-inch OLED touchscreen at a resolution of 950 by 544, for what would be quite possibly the best image quality seen in a handheld to date. This dwarfed the screens of the 3DS in terms of both size and resolution. A later slim revision of the console would move from the OLED display to a more standard LED panel. The back of the console featured a touchpad, similar to that found on a laptop, and covered most of the back surface. This would allow for touch controls without having the face buttons be inaccessible at the same time. I don't recall using it much other than a few instances in specific games for certain actions, but it was an interesting addition nonetheless, and would foreshadow the next generation of DualShock controller released a few years later, which features a similar touchpad at its heart and continues to be a feature on new controllers. The button layout didn't differ all too much from the PSP or a DualShock controller. The ubiquitous 4 face buttons adorned with a cross, square, triangle and circle returned, 2 shoulder buttons atop the console's frame, and the D-pad in the top left exactly as expected. A second analog stick made it to the console this time around, instantly removing any of the issues that the PSP had with 3D games, due to now having the ability to move cameras around, making it far easier and less clunky to navigate in 3D space. All of these buttons were rather small though, the sticks being nowhere near full size often made them awkward, as smaller, more precise movements were much trickier to perform. It was less of an issue with the face buttons, but their small size was occasionally frustrating, and I don't even have particularly large hands either. The 6-axis gyro system also made a return in the Vita, allowing for limited motion controls to be implemented in games. The UMD format pioneered by Sony for the PSP was out for the Vita, replaced with a proprietary cartridge format, somewhat similar in size and shape to a full-size SD card, but not quite the same. These new game carts were 4GB in capacity, with a small portion of this reserved for game updates. Given the alleged power of the system and the targeted graphical fidelity, this wasn't a huge amount of space for games to be crammed into. Sony once again annoyed everybody by using proprietary format for their memory cards. The PSP's use of Memory Stick Pro Duo was irritating, but the cards themselves had uses in other applications, such as photography, so prices never got too high. Vita memory cards, however, were only ever used in the Vita. Available in a variety of different capacities, ranging from 4 up to 64GB, they were very expensive, with the 4GB one costing as much as some games, and the top models coming out at over $120. Nowadays, they're not too expensive on the second-hand market, which is a good thing, because Sony ended production of them in 2019. All of this was under the guise of preventing the console being hacked and modified, something it did absolutely nothing to stop. Thankfully, now adapters exist that allow the use of micro SD cards to greatly expand the storage capacity of the Vita, though these do require the console to be modified in order to work. All of this was powered by a quad-core ARM Cortex-A9 processor with 512MB of system memory and 128MB of video memory. The same chipset used by several phones on the market at the time and the second generation of Apple's iPad. The average battery life on the system was between 3 and 5 hours while playing games, depending on how demanding they were, and the latest slim model manages to extend this to between 4 and 6 hours. This was comparable to the battery life of the 3DS, despite the Vita having far more powerful hardware. 2 versions of the console were available at launch. The first was a standard version that used Wi-Fi to connect to the internet, and the second was a 3G enabled model. This allowed a mobile SIM card to be inserted into the console, and allowed for the use of internet on the go, though this would obviously be subject to tariffs at whatever rate the SIM provider set. Many of the PS3's features successfully transitioned to the Vita, along with some new ones. A fully featured and surprisingly usable web browser was available, and made full use of the 3G model's ability to use the internet on the go. This, along with the PlayStation Store making a return, more or less unaltered from the PS3 version, meant that a user's games were available pretty much anywhere. I've only ever owned the Wi-Fi model, and don't actually know anyone who had the 3G one either, so I can't really comment on how well it worked. It was a limited system though, to alleviate network strain. Web browsing, PSN messaging, leaderboards and asynchronous multiplayer was allowed, but little else due to a 20 meg download cap that was in place. Vita games had full trophy support, something that the PSP lacked, with most titles that featured on both PS3 and Vita having their own lists rather than sharing one, though this wasn't always the case. Some titles were full cross-platform and progression too, which was a welcome addition. A game such as Final Fantasy X Remastered could be started on the PS3, continued on the Vita while out and about, and then later on the PS3 very easily, with only a short upload and download being required from the menu in the game. It was a really nice feature that not enough games took advantage of. Cross-buy was another feature that didn't come up anywhere near enough. If a game was released on both PS3 and Vita and supported cross-buy, buying the PS3 version of the game would also grant access to the Vita version. This was later extended to some titles for PS4 too. It was a great way to build up a library of games relatively quickly and cheaply, with 383 games supporting the service. The system was more or less fully backwards compatible with PSP games, albeit digitally only due to the lack of a UMD drive. The late addition to the Vita was Remote Play with PS4. This allowed a PS4 console to stream whatever game was being played directly to the Vita, with the Vita acting as a controller. It wasn't a feature that I used extensively by any means, but it was cool to have either way. Sony evidently seemed to think so too, as their upcoming sequel to the Vita is basically this exclusively, rather than a fully fledged handheld console. The PlayStation Vita was officially unleashed on the world on December 17, 2011 in Japan, 2 months later in North America, and a week following that in Europe. It launched at $250, the same price as the Nintendo 3DS that released earlier on in the year. A decent lineup of games hit the system at launch, with 26 being initially available in Japan. Uncharted Golden Abyss was the star of the show, bringing a surprisingly faithful recreation of Nathan Drake's adventures to the handheld in a totally new story. Wipeout 2048 was another strong entry, bringing Sony's iconic anti-gravity racer to the platform, along with Rayman Origins in fulfilling platformer duties. 300,000 units were sold in the first week in Japan, though this trailed off dramatically over the following weeks. A similar story was reported in the US, with strong sales of 200,000 units in the first week, and a sudden drop-off from then on. By the European launch, it was reported that 1.2 million consoles had been sold. Reviews of the Vita were generally positive, however it didn't perform particularly well from a sales perspective outside of its first weeks. OLED display was praised almost unanimously, but this changed significantly with the release of the Slim model, the LED screen garnering far less praise due to the reduction in image quality. The Slim model was praised in general, however, due to the improvements made over the original, such as improved battery life and lowering the size and weight of the console while maintaining the same screen size. It's unclear exactly why it didn't perform particularly well from a sales perspective. A strong lineup of games hit the Vita, titles like Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation, Killzone Mercenary, Final Fantasy X HD, and the Metal Gear Solid HD collection all left a good impression, and many PS3 games got serviceable ports to the Vita, with the reduction in graphics quality often being the only difference to their home console counterparts. Memory cards often get mentioned when the topic comes up though. The high price for a low amount of storage was a pretty big turn-off in an era that was rapidly adopting digital distribution. A Monster Hunter game, which was heralded by many to be what kickstarted the PSP, was missing from the Vita's lineup and exclusive to Nintendo during this period. All of these things contributed to low sales, which in turn led to third-party publishers winding down their support for the Vita, which then led to lower sales due to no games being released, resulting in a pretty textbook example of a death spiral. Sony stopped producing first-party games for the Vita in 2015, which was essentially the beginning of the end. The third-party devs continued to release games up to 2021, when Sony closed the platform to new submissions. The Vita is seen by many to have been a failure, and it was commercially. Despite reviewing well, it sold poorly, and continued the meme of Sony's platforms having no games due to the relatively small library that was available to it outside of Japan. Some fantastic games released for it, with many being exclusive to the platform, but at the same time there's a lot of low quality releases and ports. Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified is notoriously bad, and WRC 5 is one of the worst games I've ever played. Sony officially discontinued the Vita in 2019, giving it an 8-year lifespan. Though realistically, it was only a Sony press release away from being done in 2015. It's unclear exactly how many units have been sold in total, due to no figures being officially released. It's estimated to be around 15 to 16 million units. A far cry from the 80 million units that the PSP sold and the 75 million of the 3DS. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this. Did you own a Vita, or did you skip it in favour of the 3DS? Let me know down in the comments.